This video will review a 2014 Giant Trance 275-1. The 1 is their top-of-the-line aluminum model. I made 4 other reviews which went into more detail as I got the bike and then all the way up to 3 months of riding. This video is going to be a summary of those videos and more of a complete review of the bike. I'll start with the components that this bike comes spec'd with. It comes with SLX brakes. It's got a 180 front rotor and a 160 rear, which is, I feel, a really good application for this bike. XT rear derailleur is the Shadow Plus, so when you push this lever down, it allows you to get the wheel out, loosens up the spring, and then it stiffens it up, which really makes for a quiet chain, especially on descents. And while I'm talking about the chain and descents, I'll just mention it does come with a MRP chain guide, which is a great spec for this bike. If you've ever dropped chains on a downhill, you'll really appreciate a chain guide. And this chain guide rolls really smooth. I don't notice any friction in the drivetrain. It does have rollers, so it's kind of like derailleur pulleys and the wheels on a derailleur. It's got those inside the chain guide, so the chain rolls smoothly and again, quiet on the descents and keeps it in place so it doesn't drop. It comes with an SLX front derailleur. It's a braze-on front derailleur, which is really nice. Keeps it nice and stiff and smooth. It comes with XT cranks. So I'm really happy with the component spec that Giant put on it. I don't need, top-of-the-line XTR, XO on my trail bike. A little extra weight is fine. These components are really durable. And so again, really happy with the spec on this bike. It does come with a Fox CTD shock, and this shock is fully open to the left. You've got your Pro pedal setting in the middle, and then over to the right is fully locked out. Some bikes, when you go over to the right, it still moves a little bit on some of the CTD shocks. What I've noticed is more of the cross-country tuned shocks, it still moves a little bit because the travel is less. You don't have to keep that travel in check as much on a cross-country bike. This bike has 140 millimeters of travel front and rear, and so it's really nice to be able to lock it out on pavement and on fire roads. Climbing single track, I usually kept it over in the Pro pedal setting, and I'll talk more about the climbing characteristics in a few minutes. It also comes with a Talus fork, and the Talus is a 140 when it's fully open and 120 when it's dialed down. So right now I've got it dialed down, and you flip this lever over, it'll open up the shock and stretch it out to 140. I have used this a lot when riding in the mountains. When I'm in more of flat land riding, I usually keep the Talus in the 140 setting. When I'm climbing steep single track and even steep roads, I will dial it down to 120, which keeps the front end from wandering around. This bike has a 67-degree head angle, which I feel like the geometry on this bike is really dialed in. The bike corners probably better than any bike that I've ever ridden, and a lot of things come into play to make that happen. You've got some pretty beefy tires, which grip really well. They also roll well for the amount of tread that they have on them. The head angle being at 67 degrees allows for a lot of stability in the corners. The 650B wheels allow for a lot of traction in the corners and also allow for a good amount of stability. This bike comes with a 70 millimeter stem and a 730 millimeter wide bar, which I feel is a good application. It's not too wide like a downhill bike bar, or it's not too narrow like a cross-country bar. Really good application. The cockpit allows for really aggressive cornering and descending, and your weight is not too far forward on descents, and it's not too far back when you're climbing. So everything on this bike is set up really well for the trail application, which is climbing some steep stuff, but really lighting it up on the descents. This bike comes with a Giant contact dropper seat post. When I first got the bike, I had problems with it because there's an air chamber inside, and the reason they put that chamber in there is to give pressure to the seat post. That chamber did not have any pressure in it when I got the seat post, so it would not return. Giant did send a new one. The new one is working fine. This seat post is designed so that you can run it with an internal cable routing or an external. It comes internal, which is preferred, because I had some Giant Reigns in the past that was external, and I actually had problems with the cable hitting the tire when I lowered the seat post, and that caused the cable to get shredded. So I really like the internal, but if you get this seat post as an aftermarket post, you can actually run it externally too. You kind of open up the seat post, flip that chamber around, and then it allows you to run it externally. I actually prefer seat posts that don't return slowly. Some companies kind of boast about how their seat post will return slowly as a hydraulic post. This one, I'm going to hit the lever here and return it. You can, if you hold the lever down gradually, you can return it slowly, or if you hold the lever down all the way, it'll return quickly. I like a quick return because what I find with this seat post is I'll even use it for setting up for just one corner if I'm riding a more flatland type riding, and I'll lower it for the corner, and then as soon as I stand up to pedal, I want the seat post to come up with me. I've never had a problem with it coming up too fast and hitting my butt. It really just it works well, and I really like the seat post. There's really no side-to-side play in the seat post. I've used it for 3 months now, and it's held up really well. Again, after I got that cartridge changed out, it's worked fine. So I really like the dropper seat post. Once you start using one of these, it's hard to not use one, especially when you're in terrain where it's you've got rollers. You're going down for a little bit and then up for a little bit. And like I said, even using it just for a few corners when you want to slam a corner hard, getting your center of gravity low on corners and descents just allows you to get around corners quicker and gives you more stability. These have really become standard on trail bikes. One of the biggest complaints that I've had with this bike is the water bottle placement. The water bottle bolts are high. This cage is one that has different bolt patterns, so you can run the cage lower, if you can see that there. So what that means is a standard water bottle cage and a standard water bottle will not fit on this bike. This particular water bottle is a little bit lower than some of the other standard water bottles, and also the cage I have put a little bit lower, so you're going to have to keep that in mind. You've got to find a cage that allows it to be dropped lower, so in other words the bolt holes are higher. Another complaint that I've had with this bike is the fact that it does not come with a 142 through axle. It's a 135 spacing. This frame is convertible to a 142. It's really easy to convert, but I don't think you can convert these hubs. So if you buy a complete bike, it's really expensive. You'd have to get a whole new wheel basically if you wanted to convert it, and of course get the axle. That being said, the rear end is still pretty stiff. I'm fairly light, about 145 pounds. I've not noticed any flex in the rear. It holds the line well going into corners, and on descents that are really chunky, I don't feel like the rear end moves around. So the Maestro suspension does keep everything stiff, but I would have liked to have seen Giant put a 142 through axle on the rear. The front end is also stiff, and part of that is due to Giant's overdrive, which if you're not familiar with it, it uses a 1.5 inch diameter steerer tube at the bottom, which is pretty standard, but at the top it's got a 1 1/4 inch diameter at the steerer tube. Most bikes are 1 1/8 inch tapered, so 1.5 at the bottom, 1 1/8 at the top. The 1 1/4 at the top does allow for a little bit stiffer front end. The downside is if you wanted to go with a different stem, you'd have to go with a Giant, because a standard stem would be 1 1/8, and that wouldn't fit on this bike. So you're stuck with Giant stems. Fortunately for me, I really like the stem on this bike, so I'm not changing it out. But you know, again, the overdrive does keep the front end pretty stiff. Of course, it does have the 15 QR. Now, it comes with a 32 millimeter stanchion fork, which, you know, is good in the sense that it keeps the fork a little bit lighter. If I would have bought a fork as an aftermarket, I probably would have gone with a 34 millimeter, just since it's a trail bike. But to Giant's credit, they do offer another model of this bike, which is more geared towards downhill, which does come with a 34 millimeter stanchion fork. But that one comes with a single chain ring in the front, which I need a double. I really like having a 2x in the front. If you need to dump a bunch of gears real quick coming around a corner, you can just drop them with the front derailleur. So again, I like the component specs. I really wouldn't change it. I do have a 1x on my cross-country bike, but for trail riding, I actually prefer a 2x. Let me go into some of the riding characteristics on this bike. I live in more of a flatter land type riding, which does have a lot of rollers, but it's not like riding in the mountains. And what I found is on those trails, compared to a cross-country bike, this bike will feel a little bit sluggish. And really that's due to the heavier wheels and the heavier bike itself. This bike is a little under 30 pounds, which is respectable for a trail bike, but if you're coming off a cross-country bike, it does feel a little bit sluggish. But what I found is once I get up into the mountains, it really doesn't come into play. This bike will not just dart up a climb like a cross-country bike. So as with most trail bikes, you've just got to settle in your mind that you're not going to get up a climb as fast. But this is a really steady climber. Part of that is due to the Maestro suspension. Again, running it mainly in the Pro Pedal setting when going up climbs on single track, the Maestro suspension does not move hardly at all. Even when you get out of the saddle, there's not much movement in the suspension. So you can just do a nice steady climb, absorbing roots and rocks as you're climbing, but when you don't need the suspension, it doesn't move. And Maestro is what I found probably one of my favorite virtual pivot type suspensions. It's not as stiff as a DW link suspension. It's more plush, which I actually prefer. And so again, it is one of my favorite suspensions. And when you're coming down, this bike, it just floats on downhills. The Maestro suspension doesn't have any brake jacking. It's really fluid and plush. You're able to just fly over roots and rocks at a high speed. The Maestro suspension doesn't wander side to side, so there's no lateral movement. And so you're able to really hold a steady line coming down hills. And the bike is really steady on the descents. Again, because of the Maestro, but also the 650B wheels allow for a lot of agility on the descents. I'm able to dart around rocks and roots and trees when I need to, but the bike is also more stable than a 26er. So, really, really awesome descender. This bike is made for descending, and it really comes alive on the descents. I'll point out that I really like the cable routing on this bike. It's really clean. Some of the older Giant Trances and Anthems had an external routing where it kind of came out here and jumped across and kind of moved across the shock. This one is again really clean. If you're building this bike from the ground up, it's easy to run the cables through. I got this as a complete bike, but I did build up a Giant Anthem 27.5 a few weeks ago, which has the same style of routing. It was really easy to get the cables through the frame. And again, it's really clean. I don't hear the cables bouncing around on descents. And the front derailleur and the dropper seat post come in here. The seat post cable stays totally inside the frame. Giant did route the rear brake inside the frame, which was nice because it does have bosses on the frame if you were running the rear brake externally, if you didn't want to cut the cable to get it through. So it does have the bosses, which is nice that they included those. Ironically though, Giant didn't route the rear derailleur through the frame, which is a lot easier to do than the rear brake. So I don't know why they did that. If you ran it through the frame, it would come out here in the back. So it's probably something that I'll do whenever I change my derailleur cable. But and it does come with a really good chainstay protector. I always go the extra mile and just take an old inner tube and wrap it up, again, just to protect the frame a little bit more. But it does come with a nice chainstay protector, which you can't see. Let me wrap up this review by talking about the 650B wheels, because they're still really coming on the scene. Giant has an ad that I saw the other day where they say that you no longer have to choose between speed and agility. I'm not one that really gets into marketing hype, because a lot of it is like I said, it's hype. But I feel like that statement is pretty accurate for this bike. This bike is more nimble than the 29ers that I've ridden, and it's more stable and has more grip in the corners and climbing than a 26er. And you know, it's not going to be as fast as a 29er on a straight line, but most of the trails that I ride are not straight line. There's a lot of twists, a lot of turns. So I feel like 650B in the trail bike application, which would be, I would say, between 120 millimeters to 160 millimeters of travel, I feel like 650B is going to be the norm, and for a good reason. It's what I would choose at this point for a trail bike. If you're looking at a cross-country application, it's going to depend on your riding style, and it's going to depend on the terrain that you normally ride. If it's really rocky and rooty, but you don't have a lot of corners, 29er is probably the way to go for cross-country. If I were to get a cross-country hardtail, I would go with a 29er. For cross-country full suspension, right now I'm leaning towards 27.5, but again, my trails have a lot of twists and turns. So that's going to wrap up my review of this Giant Trance 27.5.1. Again, if you want more detail on some of the things that I've gone over, you can go back and watch some of my other reviews that I've done on this bike. Thanks for watching.